Welcome back to Be the Change podcast with me, Stephanie Howlett, CEO of Diversity NL. Have a listen as we explore real life, vulnerable topics on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Become awakened, create culture of inclusion, be brave, have impact by being an ally. Explore how you can be the change that you always wanted to be. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Uktamaguk as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We'd like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We open our hearts and minds as we strive for respectful relationships with all First Peoples of this province. We search for collective healing and true reconciliation as we honor this beautiful land together and commit ourselves to being stewards who will respect the cultures, traditions, and ceremonies of all who call it home. Welcome back to Be the Change podcast. I have a very special guest for us today, Cathy Bennett. Welcome, Cathy, to the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Let's get into a little bit about you. You have a very wide and varied background. So award-winning CEO and seasoned entrepreneur. Your focus and continues to be on growth. And I know you're involved in a lot of different tech spaces. We saw this week in a venture capital, getting into what that looks like for companies and organizations, getting into the different funds that are out there, getting to shine light on our tech industry, which is during Innovation Week. It's wide, it's bright, and I think there's a lot to look forward to within our province of Newfoundland and Labrador. You're involved with Sandpiper Ventures, which is a venture capital fund created and launched to invest in women and women's innovation as a proactive and profitable business decision. And through Sandpiper as well is one of the first venture funds in Canada investing in women-led companies at the seed stage, which is amazing, honestly, because we know women and gender diverse folks, we don't always get that opportunity, which we're going to get into. As well, your focus is on startups, which is fantastic. And you're a associate fellow in the Destruction Lab and a board member with Propel ICT. You're involved in a whole bunch of different spaces. You're a mentor to many different organizations and companies. I know that. You don't know it, but you're one of my mentors that I follow. And you're involved in a whole bunch of different board work, Marathon Gold. And we know that you've been a guru when it's come to McDonald's, in our province, certainly, and when it's come to being an elected member of government. So you have a very wide and varied background. So I'm delighted to have you on our show today to have a conversation about leadership and what that looks like.
Well, I hope I can live up to the expectations.
I love going through people's bios, and when you make a few tweaks and changes with them, it's all fun. So, but looking at your background, how did you get to where you're to with your education, with your story of, how you grew up? Is this something you've always wanted to do?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, confidentially between all of us on this podcast.
Absolutely.
My ambition when I finished high school was to be a physicist. Actually went to university, was going to be a physicist. Like many, young people transitioning into university, that first year is tough. We had some family trauma at the time, and my sister was really sick. And so for me, work was easier than investing my time in academic studies. So I ended up taking a part-time job at the local McDonald's, and that put me on a track that led to a whole bunch of different opportunities that I never, ever expected. There was a moment in time in those early years where I thought nursing was potential. I wrote the exam, was accepted, but at the same time, I got offered a promotion in the McDonald's system, and I was excited about the corporate ladder opportunities that I could see there.
Wow. I didn't know that, by the way. That's interesting. So how did that expand into owning your own multiple different businesses?
Yes, I spent 17 years working for somebody else who was operating the restaurants, and it gave me the privilege to benefit from what was a very robust development program, not only for management, but for leadership inside the McDonald's global organization. I often think back to how many lessons I learned going through the various stages of training and how much I take that into not just my professional life, but even my personal life. So it was a really awesome place to learn. And it was really a good place to make a lot of mistakes too. I mean, the stakes were not as high as they would be in, brain surgery, but they certainly were as high when it came to dealing with people. And for me, it was an environment that allowed me to really hone my people skills and understand that, folks like Richard Branson and others who say, take care of your employees will take care of your customers, and your customers will take care of you, really understand how business is supposed to work. So it was a real fertile learning ground for me to hone skills that I knew were important.
Absolutely. I love that because relationship building and really getting to know your employees. And a lot of the work I do is having conversations like this of how important it is to build those relationships and grow those relationships. And I find when you start to care about people and show support, it's that growth opportunity. It
Oh,
flourishes. People,
absolutely. They excel. I mean, when you put a spotlight on somebody who's not used to having the spotlight, and I mean the spotlight in a positive way, um, you can see, the light just raise people and raise their ambitions. And I think there's been lots of validation over my career, certainly the McDonald's restaurant system, where folks have reached back out to me years later and said, "You don't know this, Cathy, but you did this for me, and it made an impact." And those are pretty powerful when you think about the impact leaders have on folks that they work with. It's been a real gift. And after 17 years, I decided it was time to see if I could become an operator. Was approved to open up a restaurant in rural Ontario, I think. But the opportunity to purchase the stores that I had grown up in presented itself. And that was just the most precious gift, because to be able to stay and work with the team that we had nurtured and created, but also to treat them within the values of what I wanted reflected in my business. And I wanted our team to reflect the community very much. And we worked hard to make that happen. It was a real privilege to be able to spend the next, 15, 16 years building out our own set of franchises.
yeah. So within McDonald's, I'm going to suggest that you're one of the first organizations and companies that looked at bringing in people from different diverse backgrounds, going through different processes of immigration, I'm going to suggest, and different things like that. And when you can see the diversity part of businesses and how much they grow and expand and flourish, to me, it's amazing. And not everyone gets the business case for why do we look at diversity and
Mm-hmm.
how that creates innovation within our companies and organizations.
Oh yeah, I think one of the big lessons for me, and I was privileged because as a leader, whether it was my former boss or whether it was the organization that I ran as an owner operator, the team gave me the space to be innovative. And I think innovation is really important in maintaining and advancing diversity in the workplace. A couple of examples, quick examples I'll give you. I remember, being told by somebody, well, we will never be able to hire somebody with a disability in the drive-through, for example. And I was like, well, why? And we actually figured out a way, right? Built a platform, and we hired folks that would be in wheelchairs or would have other physical disabilities, and those folks contributed equally, if not more, than the teams that we had, and the camaraderie and the teamwork was amazing. On the other end of the spectrum, I had the privilege of working with some refugees in Kosovo. When our oldest son, Cameron, who you met, was 6 months old, we got a chance to be part of a community group that was sponsoring a family from Kosovo. They didn't speak any English when they showed up in Newfoundland. And I was able to hire two of them to come to work with us, the dad and the oldest daughter. And for the 2 years that they spent in Newfoundland before they went back to Kosovo, it was the work they did in the McDonald's restaurant and the nurturing that the team did to help them with their English language that ultimately put them on a path when they went back to Kosovo to work as translators with the United Nations. Now, when you think
Wow.
about that type of impact on people, I'm not sure many people would think of, a renowned translator in Europe having their start in English on McDonald's in Torbay Road. But that's exactly what happened.
That is amazing. Like these are the untold stories that we don't always hear
Mm-hmm.
that I think is important for us to shine light on how this, I'm going to call it kindness, how this piece of kindness from you and your family and employees and that team created such an impact in people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a lot of privileges. And when I bring up the word privilege, sometimes people become uncomfortable with it because they think that I'm talking about taking things away from you. But, it's not like pie. We all have the privileges and there's lots to go around. It's how we
Mm-hmm.
use them. So I love that example of you using your privilege to do better within our local ecosystem. And now it's, gone to the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's been all those stories just validated that our choices as a team, not just in my choice as a leader, but the choice that our entire team supported, it just gave back in spades to us, and it was the right decision to do. Every single time we made a diversity hire, and we pushed ourselves to think openly and sometimes more pragmatically about how to make the workplace um, more conducive to folks that might look different than me, whatever that might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, when we talk about organizations, we look at how can companies internally reflect our external customers,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of aspect. And Newfoundland and Labrador is becoming more diverse, as we can see. And, how do we do that hiring of folks that may be different from you, that might have a disability, might be from a different community, background, ethnicity, neurodiversity, age, like there's so many different areas that we can look at. And I know that you've done a lot of work within the tech space, and they're still doing a lot of work in the tech space. I want to shine light a little bit on the gender, like women, us as women,
Mm-hmm.
and how that looks when it comes to, I guess, entrepreneurship and really breaking that ground with startup companies.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest privileges I had because I was a joint venture partner with McDonald's when I started my business. I had, this big brand standing behind me when I went to the bank. Um, I thought they were lending Cathy Bennett money, but over time I recognized that they were lending the joint venture, of which McDonald's Canada was a big part of it. They were lending us collectively the money. And what I learned over my career, and more acutely when I was in government and I was minister responsible for the status of women, was how money and power and domestic violence are very linked in our communities, and that those that have money can do things differently. They can grow businesses. So I learned an awful lot through attending great conferences, for example, the United Nations, and networking with other ministers around this power dynamic associated with capital. So when I came out and retired from politics, one of my ambitions was I had been a longtime angel investor. I hadn't really understood whether or not there was a bias there, but I did a bunch of research and then met up with some like-minded women who felt that the scales needed to be purposely changed. So I did work with colleagues to create Sandpiper Ventures. And our thesis was that, the research says that women are more efficient in the capital that they are provided by investors, and they get to revenue faster. So it's illogical from a business perspective why they wouldn't have equal access to capital. But we know that in the VC space, which is a very unique high risk space for capital to be deployed, women only get about 2 to 4% of the capital there. If we go to small business loans, we also know that one of the biggest challenges that women have there is that in many cases women are the ones that don't necessarily have the assets, or the assets aren't in their name, or their earnings have been interrupted by years of taking a bit of time off to have a baby, and that has real meaningful impact in the back of the banking system when you think about the risk desk and the risk appetites for banking institutions. So in addition to Sandpiper, I worked with a group, CDBCs out of New Brunswick, on a leading lenders program to help small business loan officers understand how to ask questions differently to folks that are in the small business space, particularly women who often get asked a lot more risk questions than they get asked growth questions. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really the academic research will say that part of the reason these systems aren't built for women is that the questions we get asked don't allow us to talk about the growth and the excitement and the things that we're supercharged about with our companies. We get grilled on, do we know all the risks?
Mm-hmm.
And that pitch doesn't go the same way if you're talking about growth or you're talking about risk.
Absolutely. So I would suggest there's some inherent biases in all of us when
Mm-hmm.
it comes to that piece. No matter if you were, a male or a female, and you answered it the same way, that officer, whomever it is that's giving you money, is going to have different stances on
Mm-hmm.
just I guess, should I give it to you? That you know, are we going to get our money back? Is it good? Like, what's that risk?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, for me, one of the privileges at this stage of my life, I will often say I have a purposeful declared bias and I'm proud that I'm living it because
Mm-hmm.
some biases, actually help us think a little bit differently and bring the conversation to it. And I hope that that's what my work with Sandpiper demonstrates is that I'm actuating a purposeful bias there. But I also know that, when we do inside our investment committee, when we have conversations, making sure that I don't slip into the bias that I know is in the questions that you could ask founders. And, I stand with a script in front of me to continue to build the muscle memory, not to ask the questions about risk, but to ask the questions about growth, because I've been a business operator for 35 years. I typically will go to the risk questions because I know
Mm-hmm.
that's where generally questions are. So even my own behavior I've had to modify and continue to modify and unlearn things that maybe I thought were the right approaches years ago. And now I want to do them a little differently because I'm making a purposeful choice.
Absolutely. So how do you see, I guess, women within the tech space and I guess within the business space in Newfoundland and Labrador? I guess, how do you see us best as leaders and as people in the business community? How can we best help, I guess, in that way? How can we best use our privilege, use our, um, create the most impact? Like, how do we use ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm just in awe of what has been created in the community recently with folks that and I'm sure you've had them on the podcast around Techquity Plus. I mean, this is an organization that organically has grown in the community where women owners, women founders, women in the tech industry, people servicing the tech industry, I think they even drift to those circles, can get together and talk about really important learnings around biases, and I think that's unique. There's nothing else like it in Atlantic Canada that I've seen, and I don't think I've seen the similar models of that really truthful, transparent conversation in that condensed way happening broadly. I think that's one of the things that makes Newfoundland and Labrador different for me is that there are organizations like that. There are great people like you who are out in the community doing the work that you do to help us unlearn those things. Like Stephanie, years ago when I was in my 30s, I would say, people are mean because they choose to be mean, right? But as I've softened and the gray hair has come in and I'm, a little older now, just a little bit, I think we learn to be mean for a whole lot of reasons, and unlearning that and adopting a personal mission of being kind is very achievable. And you can see it happening. I mean, what happened on Facebook with Ukrainian refugees and how much energy pours into supporting those people. And I know it's not perfect, and I know there's a lot of pain still there, and there's things left undone. But I think those are all the things that give me hope that we as a community recognize there's things we have to unlearn, and we didn't learn them on purpose. We
Mm-hmm.
just happened to learn them for a bunch of circumstances. And I like to assume innocence until, I think where I draw the line is if you've been given a chance to learn and then you don't change, then I think that's a choice. And that choice needs to be dealt with differently.
Right. Definitely. So yeah, the Techquity Plus is definitely a great space that Jacqueline Lee and a whole bunch of other folks have definitely created for the tech space and beyond. Because there's people there that are people that I guess like me that do I guess kind of consulting for tech and a whole bunch of different organizations, but there's people there in all different spaces, all different backgrounds. And I think it's that safer space where people get to have discussions like there's no other. And you're right that I haven't come across any other space that looks like that, which is, fantastic. And so how do we move a space like that or potentially replicate it, or do we need to replicate it for other parts of communities that exist here, I wonder?
Yeah, no, I definitely think there's an opportunity to provide safe spaces for women to have conversations. Because I do think it just not only does it spotlight in the moment for those folks that are attending those sessions, the community conversation around it brings to the surface our frontal lobe, as somebody used to say to me, brings to the front of our brain, the more kind of immediate need to be thinking about it and reflecting it in whatever we're doing, whether it's in the industrial industries. I mean, I've had the opportunity to sit on a couple of mining boards, but I also, as a former minister, I accepted complaints from industrial fabrication and industrial projects where women weren't necessarily welcomed and recognized, and people of diversity weren't. So there's a constant unlearning that has to happen. So it's not just in the tech sector; it's across industrial sectors, it's across health sectors, it's across commercial sectors, export sectors. There's always some unlearning we can do, and just I guess the same way as folks would say, "I'm on a journey of continuous learning." I think we should all be on a journey of continuous unlearning, because there's always going to be, well, it was okay for me in my 30s, to have my boss say, you're not going to get promoted because you might get pregnant, so I'm going to promote the other guy, but you're okay with that. And for me to say, yeah, I'm okay with that. Like, women today shouldn't say that, but time changes, and I think we all have some unlearning to do. It doesn't matter what the sector is.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think we have a robust business community and community in general throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. And a lot of businesses are thriving. I'm going to say that. A lot of businesses probably are going through maybe a little bit of a downturn as well. I'm just kind of wondering how, maybe if there's different considerations that we can put out there that they can look at when it comes to the diverse populations, maybe that they haven't thought about before.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so essential when you're building a human resource plan to look at how you can activate, as you said earlier, maybe with different words, the community that you serve, right? Because I think there's talent and there's customer insights that you get from employing a diverse workforce. And there's folks in our community who are, I use the term underutilized, but probably the better way to say it is under-recognized for their contribution. We had some of our star employees, I remember in the restaurant business and in government when I was there, were folks that had disabilities, folks that were, neurodiverse, folks that, spoke different languages than we did. They bring a different perspective. They bring a different lens. And just like women in general, right, bring a different lens to conversations. It's really important to build your HR plan to actually know and target and recruit diverse workforces. But it's also equally important to make sure that your workforce, as it exists, is able to welcome those folks in a way that's respectful and productive. I've seen over the course of my career, cultures that have been very toxic around diversity. And, not everybody feels safe and not everybody feels welcoming. And in those situations, it's just not only the individual that's not able to perform, it's the organization that's held back from the growth that is possible from a productive culture. And I would argue that never before in our history in Newfoundland and Labrador have we needed every single industry and sector to be performing on 5 cylinders. Right? We need, as we transition, as we go through an energy transition, as we go through the transition of age and population, We need everything firing on all cylinders. So to have any organization held back purposely by a culture that isn't healthy, or unintentionally by a culture that's not healthy, especially when there's folks like you in the community to help them, just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, so organizations, I'm always try to take the higher ground of educating. We're all going to learn and unlearn, and sometimes it's a different thought process. Maybe people haven't thought about. Sometimes it's just not knowing, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's cultural differences, not knowing. I'm going to give them a kind of a pass and try to do the teachable moments, which is really hard
Right.
sometimes, depending on that conversation that we're having. And I'm sure you've had some of these as well over your years of what that looks like within, because I've come from a health background mostly, and looking at what that looks like. And you come from a variety of different backgrounds, and you've been involved in a lot of different businesses and organizations. So how can we kind of talk me through a little bit of a journey? How do you think that we can kind of do better as people, like as just individuals, not even as business people, but as individuals that might be listening to the podcast? Like, how about Cathy? How can I do better as a person?
Well, I think let me answer it in two ways. As a person, I think you have to recognize that we're all fallible and we have biases and nobody's perfect and we all have unlearning to do. And that's every single one of us, right? So if you think about an openness to your own opportunity to learn or unlearn, then you're going to be more receptive. I think as leaders, that's a different answer, because I think as leaders, we have to have a shadow of the leader that is reflecting the behaviors that we want others around our team to reflect. And if we tolerate anything that we don't want to be tolerated, then that's on us as leaders. So, while I would go back to my years of working with large teams, I used to always say, I'm going to be firm and fair. I'm going to be fair to make sure that you've got the training and the education, and I'm going to help you get insights and unlearn if there's unlearning to happen. But there's zero tolerance when it comes to a policy, because we're going to act for the whole, not the individual who's choosing not to be part of the team. And I think as leaders, those are tough conversations to have. So my advice to leaders is make sure that you're investing the professional development time on yourself to be able to have the difficult conversations that are transparent, authentic, truthful, and accountable, so that the culture that you want to create, those that are participating in it by choice, should be dealt with. And those that are actuating those values should be praised and raised in the team and celebrated, because they are casting the shadow that you want reflected as leader.
Absolutely. I think that, when we look at where should we hold leaders when it comes to this, it's kind of from that, you want to see the leader being, you're at the top, you're the one that's putting out the tone, you're putting out the messaging, you're really walking the walk. You're not saying, hey, HR folks, do this policy, but it doesn't apply to you. So it's
Absolutely.
really walking that. And we see that, unfortunately, with organizations. The HR people are doing their best. They're trying to do some transformative work, but if your leaders aren't on board and are not doing the appropriate messaging and aren't living it, because I always say, when you're doing the work with me, it's not always easy. You're going to be transformative. You're going to get some feedback that's going to be negative, of course, like you do in everything when you're trying to change and shift organizations. Mm-hmm. But the work, ultimately, it does transform in that positive, impactful way. But you got to walk it. Yeah. You got to live it. It's, kind of the DNA, putting it into your organization.
Yeah. And just to go back for a second to the personal, I mean, one of the big lessons I learned along the way, and I didn't have this confidence in my 20s. It was something that was a learned skill. It's okay to ask people, what can I do to make you feel more comfortable? What can I do that's going to help you in this environment? Like, if we don't know, we shouldn't expect that we're going to know intuitively what somebody else needs, because we're not living the life that they're living, right? We're not living with whatever circumstances, whatever history, whatever background, whatever privilege they have, or lack of privilege they have. So to me, I thought that, the best questions were always, if I say your name wrong, please correct me. It's so important that I say your name right, as an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or can you please tell me how we can work together to help make sure that the accommodations that are going to optimize your performance are the right ones that we make. Don't let me assume I know what those are.
Mm-hmm.
So that transparency for me was a really powerful way to learn and be better at responding to folks that were in our workforce that had different needs, but brilliant contributors too.
Yeah. So how can I best support you? Like, we don't always ask that question.
Right.
And then we're wondering why people aren't living up to that standard that we have. They're
Mm-hmm.
not bringing maybe their best self, or maybe
Yeah.
there's some sort of a workplace thing that they may need.
Yeah.
And it might be something very simple. It might be a headset. It could be lighting. It could be
Mm-hmm.
noise reduction. Like, there's so many different things that we all need within workplaces that,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, when people hear the word accommodation, is like money, it's going to cost, and it's seen as a negative. But it's, how do you bring your best out of your employees?
Absolutely. And one of the tricks that we learned through some of the training programs that I had the opportunity to participate in is that's a tough question to answer as well, right? Especially if you're not used to being asked that question. So we would always teach people, ask it at least 3 times. What more can I do to be supportive? How can I be even more supportive? What else can we do to be even more supportive? And maybe it's done over a series of a couple of minutes like I just did, or it's done over a series of days or months, but ask it multiple times so that you can get to the surface, under the surface level of what the answer is. Because I think it's a hard question to ask if you're not used to it, and you got to build that muscle memory, but it's a hard question to answer sometimes if you're feeling insecure in a workplace and you don't really know what the culture is for the response to that question.
100%. Because I suggest there's very few organizations most of us have ever worked in that people are asking you, how can I best support you?
Right.
And it's funny because that's one of the questions I always talk about with teams when we're team building. It's just like, I've never thought about that before. Most people say that, I've never thought about that before. I said, but how do we get our best out of people when we don't put it out there?
Yeah.
And I know that that is a tough one for a lot of us to answer, because we don't know what's the right or wrong answer to say. Because if I ask for too much, they might let me go if I'm in my probationary period. But if I don't ask for what I need, am I going to be able to cope at work? Right. So is that,
Absolutely.
it's a fine line of, like, can't we just be transparent of our needs? Because we all have certain needs, whether it could be a sense that that's something very similar, something, most people, we shouldn't be sitting for the periods of time that we do. So, what does that look like? Something easy peasy that's going to make a person's work life, 100% potentially better.
Well, and I think that question is so powerful in the workplace. It's a question for everybody. It has nothing to do for me with the focus on diversity and inclusion. It has to do with workplace health.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody on the team, you might have somebody who's dealing with trauma in their home. That you might have somebody who's dealing with something that they're not comfortable to put on the team. There's a myriad of reasons why that question is relevant for your colleagues, for your boss, and for your subordinates. It works all kinds of great ways.
It does, and I love that it's not, because when we talk diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, anti-racism, or whatever acronym you want to use, people kind of get a little bit uptight because they think, well, you're not talking about me, no one's supporting me. So what we are, like, it's the whole support of the collective we, but unfortunately sometimes, or fortunately, we do need to shine light on certain people within workplaces that haven't traditionally been supported, haven't traditionally even been brought into the workplace, let alone supported.
Well, and Stephanie, you use the word belonging, and I think that is kind of the biggest flag on the flag post for me, because you can have lots of folks who are participating in a workforce, but if they're not feeling that connectivity to their team and having that real authentic belonging, then you're not optimizing the opportunity for them. I remember having this magnificently brilliant person who worked with alongside of me, and we had her on a management track, and she kept saying, Cathy, I'm not interested in management. I don't want to do management. I can't do management. And I, over 2 years, convinced her. as she started to do her management training, I took out at that time a binder of material, not a virtual training, but a binder. And as she started to look at the binder, it was evident something was wrong. And she confessed then that she actually couldn't read. But here she was, think about it. She had been successful inside an organization that requires you to do a lot of communication with your eyes, right? To get things right. She had adapted. Just imagine how smart she was. So I think, there's all kinds of folks who, I think fundamentally humans are ambitious, and we're allowed to only be as ambitious as the environment lets us. So by asking those questions and increasing our connection to a workplace, by building our sense of belonging, by asking those questions, you definitely empower and you get stronger results, and you get those flywheels of performance and productivity, both personally and professionally, moving at a higher pace.
Definitely. Like, I love the whole conversation along belonging. I had it yesterday with a group, or two groups actually. It's like, how do we belong within towns and municipalities and those sorts of places? Is like, what does that look like for us?
Yep.
Because we leave when there's two things not in place: psychological safety, when we can't feel that we can be our authentic selves, and that sense of belonging, that inclusion. Mm-hmm. So if we feel that we're not there, we've all left workplaces for those reasons, or something. We may not have thought about it at the time. When you look back at it, it's just like, I wasn't a piece of the organization. They didn't value my voice or opinion. I hate these words. I didn't fit in. Or when an organization says you're not really the right fit, mm-hmm. What does that mean? Like, we don't want groupthink. I always say we want to add culture to our culture. We don't want people to come and fit in. We want people to challenge us. We truly do. We need them in order to make our organization grow, expand, mm-hmm. all those positivities that we need.
Yeah, 100%.
Right. So looking at praise and positivity, I think two of the most understated things that we don't use in workplace. We don't praise enough, and creating that positivity vibe, because it's just as contagious as the negativity, the Eeyore, mm-hmm. the Linus, right? Like, how do we bring that within the organizations? And when you start having that conversation, everyone kind of laughs, because it's just, they can picture their teams, right? Like, who's the Eeyore for, and they might be the Eeyore for many different reasons. Like, we all have spaces and homes that may not be, great positive spaces that mm-hmm. are supportive. So, acknowledging that as well. But how do we create that positivity and that praise within our workspaces?
Yeah.
What are some ways that you've looked at that in your past?
Yeah. I think like, we used to have a saying, praise in public, criticize in private. Mm-hmm. And it was almost like a manifesto, so that if somebody went offside with the criticism, everybody called it out, right? So you felt very comfortable as a rookie, because you knew it wasn't supposed to happen. You felt very comfortable as a rookie to be able to call it out. And that, I think, is why praising and criticizing, or critiquing, or providing constructive feedback in the right format is so important. And there's all kinds of ways to praise. I mean, I would often think that, if we can't take a moment to think about how wonderful another human being is, then we probably are struggling to remember how wonderful we are too, right? Mm-hmm. And it spreads, and it's the positive energy behind organizations. Post-it notes or confidential surveys. There's all kinds of technology tools you can use now to accelerate the volume of praise that happens in your organization. Customer feedback, right? Making sure that you're celebrating, the customer feedback, and recognizing that, critiques from customers happen faster than praise happens. So a praise should get 10 times the amplification of a customer complaint. Those are the things I think that as leaders of teams, that you have to make purposeful space for.
Absolutely. So you are a very modest person. Yes. You're not even going to answer that, see? Because you don't know where I'm going. So I want to explain to the audience how we got connected more, I guess, within the past 3.5 years ago, I guess. So I tell this funny joke of, you're the worst boss I ever have, because you called at 7:30 on a Saturday morning asking for my wife, Carol, to become involved with Task Force NL. And at some point, I'm hoping the story is going to be told. And I know you never want to tell the story because you're too modest, about how a group of business people showed up for months trying to create an impact on our economy when we were going through a pandemic of not having enough gowns, gloves, masks, and the people that showed up and worked 16, 18 hours. I don't even think you slept for months, to be honest. And either did a lot of other people. So can we talk, like spend a couple of minutes and just talk about what that meant? Because this is a massive story of, I think, leadership and of companionship and network and solidarity and just compassion.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly was one of the highlights of my professional life. It wasn't something I had planned, and it was sort of happened by accident. Um, there, I think somebody had messaged me from Montreal saying that they were making sanitizer at a brewery in Montreal, and I thought, oh, liquor corporation. I used to be the minister there. They should be able to make it, and that started with a spiral of me reaching out to folks that along the way I had developed relationships with. And what was amazing for me, nobody said no. And we had, at times, 70 to 80 people working on a given day from their house virtually on all kinds of weird projects, including making sanitizer, making gowns, making gloves, making face masks, sewing face masks around the province, to helping support the healthcare system. I think, one of the biggest stories that what hasn't been told about that period of time, we are confident, based on the information we have, that Eastern Health, now Newfoundland Health, was one of, if not the only, health authority in North America who did not have a nurse with COVID during the acute first 18 months of COVID. And I credit that to the fact that the folks in leadership at the healthcare organization, folks in community and industrial construction, and the union that was responsible for the work and the management that was responsible for work, they all collaborated and they built a unit, a COVID unit that was very unique in Newfoundland. And it was based on, emerging world technology. And it happened in 48 hours. And it could only happen here. So, the people who did that type of work, I think are the ones that should be recognized. All I did was set the agenda a little bit. That's all.
Oh yeah, no, a lot more than that. I know that from months of being on the other end, but we'll leave it there for your modesty. But like there was a lot of like it amazes me that through a phone call, how many people said yes. Like it's amazing, like how it's almost like a phone tree in a small community. It was like one of those processes, probably not for you, but that's what it seemed like for
Oh,
me,
yeah.
of everyone saying, "What can I do? How can I do it? Because we're going to need this." Our wives, our partners, our loved ones are within healthcare. How do we best support, our families at home, and how do we
Mm-hmm.
best support them? And that's kind of what it felt like, the business community coming together, saying, "What do you need?" Right?
Yeah, it was definitely a powerful period of time, and I think it's a continuing testament to many things that I've seen our community do when we are working with kindness, right? And when we're accepting everybody's talents and we're optimizing. I mean, the business people and the engineers actually work together quite
Right?
successfully, right? With the healthcare professional. So if I think back to all the things that brought me joy in my career, it was those kinds of collaborations, right? The work we did with Ronald McDonald House, the work we did with Kosovo refugees, the work that the communities all around Newfoundland did during 9/11. It was about our intense need to be kind.
Absolutely. We'll leave it on kindness matters because that's, I think, a good segue for us to leave the conversation because I
Mm-hmm.
think it is about kindness and my gratitude to you. I've known you for a number of years, and all I see from you is kindness. By the way, in the way that you give back to the community, to the business community, to those around you. So good on you. I'm hoping that other leaders will hear this podcast and follow suit, starting to look at how we can replicate some of this kindness. Not to say other leaders aren't doing it, but I think that you make this very intentional on the things that you do. So I thank you for that. Any closing words, and how can people connect in with you?
Well, if I'm on LinkedIn, so anybody who wants to reach out to me, they can connect with me on LinkedIn. And Stephanie, the last thing I'd say is there's a lot of leaders in known and unknown in our province throughout Newfoundland, Labrador, who would be sitting in this seat telling pretty powerful stories. So congratulations to you for providing a platform. And I'm sure you'll never run out of folks to talk to who are making significantly bigger impacts in the community than I ever have. So kudos to you for the platform.
I'm not sure that's the case, but I know there are a lot of leaders that are making strides and are making a lot of waves in our community in a great way to highlight that kindness matters perspective. So thanks so much for joining us here on Be the Change podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being with us today. Comment below, subscribe, connect with me at Stephanie@diversitynl.com or on LinkedIn. Be the change.